Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Catherine and this is Raspberry Reads. I'm a little bit late to the party on this, but we're going to roll with it anyways. So this video is in celebration of Nonfiction November. As far as I know, and I will correct myself on the screen if I'm wrong, Nonfiction November was created by the booktuber Olive over at A Book Olive. She's got lots of subscribers and is very well known, and I certainly know that she does Nonfiction November and has done for many years, but I'm pretty sure she created it in the first place. So anyways, the long and the short of it is this video is in recognition of Nonfiction November, and like the other videos I've created, it's going to be part of the five-star series. So this is five-star, four-star, sort of top-tier nonfiction recommendations for you today. And I've tried to pick nonfiction books that I haven't mentioned on my channel before, or at least not in any great detail. I predominantly read fiction nowadays, but I still do read nonfiction, and I certainly read a lot of nonfiction in my academic work. So yes, without any further ado, let's get started. So the first book that I wanted to give a shout out to is by Michelle Obama. So this is The Light We Carry, Overcoming in Uncertain Times. Now this came out, I think in either 2021, something like that, and or maybe even 22. And it's Michelle Obama's conversation about uncertain times being the pandemic, and she had lots of really great things to say in that book. Things about how we can overcome our differences, how do we navigate change, how do we address worries and self-doubt. Yeah, lots of really wonderful, insightful things, and she was very honest and raw in that book. I haven't read her first book, and I'd really like to get to it. But yeah, so I listened to this book on audiobook, which I would recommend because Michelle Obama narrates it herself. And the reason why I want to recommend this book now is, without getting too political, I know a lot of my viewers are having some difficult feelings related to the recent election in the US. And I think there's a lot of really valuable pieces of constructive feedback or sort of helpful tips, let's say, that Michelle Obama covers in The Light We Carry that I feel are applicable to now this uncertain time, this time of change for the US, but for the world. But yeah, so The Light We Carry, it's a great book. If you haven't read it or listened to it already, that will be my first recommendation, for Nonfiction November. The second book that I wanted to cover, and I've got a hard copy here, is There's Something in the Water, Environmental Racism in Indigenous and Black Communities by Ingrid R.G. Waldron. And this came out, later. So this came out in 2018. And there has actually been a documentary that came out, a film documentary since then, so you can go and watch that one as well. And this is an environmental book set in Nova Scotia, Canada, the province of Nova Scotia, and it looks at inequalities and environmental racism to do with water rights and connected to that land rights for both Indigenous communities throughout Nova Scotia and Black communities. And Ingrid Waldron interviewed lots of people, so it's sort of like an oral account, oral history, and she looks at not only the present day impact of inequalities to do with water and water quality, water access, but also the historical inequalities within those communities. And it's it's just a really important book. You don't have to be Canadian to appreciate it. And it's a very slim book. It's only a few hundred pages, and it's more so set in sort of case studies, so it's quite accessible in that way. You can take your time with it and just dip in and out if you wanted to. But I think if you are somebody who appreciates anything to do with intersectionalism, to do with environmentalism, climate justice, treatment of Indigenous peoples, treatment of Black people, and historic inequalities, then this book is certainly one to check out, as I think the stories that are in Nova Scotia definitely overlap with communities in the US, and to some extent I think Indigenous communities around the world. But yeah, so that's my second recommendation for Nonfiction November. There's Something in the Water. So the third book that I wanted to mention is a history book. And this is a book that my dad picked up when it came out in 2007. And then I actually read it and did a study on it for an upper level history course for my undergraduate degree. And this book is Ghost Map, the story of London's most terrifying epidemic and how it changed science, cities, and the modern world by Stephen Johnson. And this, I don't have a copy of it, but it's a fairly slim book. It wasn't very long. So yeah, this book covers the 1854 cholera epidemic within London, and how the physician John Snow ended up figuring out where this epidemic was coming from by using mapping skills. And cholera comes from not having proper sewage and access to clean water. So as I mentioned to just a second ago about there's something in the water, not that I'm suggesting that cholera outbreaks, but that is something that can happen if you don't have access to clean water and appropriate sewerage infrastructure. But yeah, so this book was about mapping the cholera epidemic and the work that John Snow did. And I just found it such a fascinating, fast-paced thriller almost, very accessible for a non-academic history book. And as I mentioned, I ended up enjoying it so much that I wrote a whole undergraduate paper on it and on John Snow and the 1854 cholera outbreak in London. So yeah, if you like history books in general, if you enjoy reading about the history of medicine and the history of science, then I would 100% recommend Stephen Johnson's The Ghost Map if you haven't read it already. Okay, the fourth book that I wanted to recommend, and this relates more so to my area of work, which is mental health, and this is called Trauma Stewardship, an everyday guide to caring for self while caring for others. And this was by Laura van Dermot Lipsky with Connie Burke. And so this is a really excellent book. As I said, if you work in mental health, or you are in a caring role, so if you're a carer for either an adult or a child who's experienced trauma, or if you've experienced trauma yourself, I think it could be helpful as well. And this book is basically looking at secondary trauma. So that's when you're caring for somebody who's experienced trauma, and then you end up taking on the trauma yourself. And it relates to compassion fatigue, and that's basically when you become so overwhelmed with trying to help that individual deal with their traumas that you end up sort of shutting down, and you can only deal with providing basic caregiving. So yeah, it has a lot of really good tips on how to look after yourself. The examples come from all sorts of different sectors, so whether that's emergency services, social care, there's actually environmental conservation in here, and that compassion fatigue that you can feel when you're, I think it's an ecologist, desperately trying to protect the natural world and fighting a losing battle. And yeah, it covers, I think there's 16 warning signs for where you might experience compassion fatigue and ways to kind of manage that. So yeah, really helpful book. I also really like the texture of the book is a really pleasing, I can't even think of, it's not slippery, it's like a little bit tactile. Yeah, pleasing cover anyways. And there's lots of really interesting little cartoons in there. It's a great accessible read, divided into nice easy to understand parts, and you see the text there, so there's all these sort of case study excerpts in it as well. But yeah, as I mentioned, if you work in any area related to mental health, whether that's being a teacher, emergency services, social care, what have you, this is a wonderful book and I can't recommend it highly enough. And the last book that I wanted to recommend to you today for Nonfiction November is a book that I'm actually reading myself. So I can't say for certain whether this will be a 4-star or a 5-star read. At the moment, I'm about halfway through it and I am leaning towards a 4-star, but in any case, it's still very much worth checking out. And that's The Lost Rainforests of Britain by Guy Shrubsole. And I'm listening to it on audiobook narrated by the author. And this is an account of Guy Shrubsole's exploration of England and looking at the temperate rainforests that still exist in England. And as the title alludes to, his argument or his project basically shows that England firstly still has temperate rainforests dotted throughout. I think he says there's only 1% of England's land mass is covered by temperate rainforests, and that it used to be much higher. But he talks about his sort of crowdsourcing citizen science project where he asked the public to fill in a form and identify on a map all the possible areas throughout England that have temperate rainforest. And so that's really interesting in and of itself, but so far in the book he's been talking about sort of the history of rainforests in general, and why we use the terminology rainforests over jungle these days. He's talking about why and how the rainforests of Britain have decreased so significantly, and it just ties very much into sort of understandings about climate change and conservation more generally. I also like that, at least so far, Guy Shrubsole is talking a lot about, it's more of a natural history account, I would say, in the sense that he's talking a lot about past culture and literature, talking about druids and I just think like the Green Man, and how all of that fits into kind of the folklore of rainforests specifically. I did also like that, at least in the beginning, he was talking about how there's this preconception that's still widely prevalent that England used to be fully covered in dense forest, sort of like pre-medieval forests, and that actually modern studies suggest that that's not the case, that it was still heavily forested, but there were also large areas of shrubland and like grasslands as well, and that there were significant pockets of temperate rainforests. And when I do a wrap up for autumn, I guess, I will talk about this book in more detail, but what I thought was really striking is how much I actually take temperate rainforests for granted, because I'm from Vancouver, and so I've grown up, from the age of 10, surrounded by dense woodland, old growth forests with redwoods, ferns and also, yeah, very much so a temperate rainforest climate. And to then appreciate that there are only very small pockets of an equivalent left in Britain, yeah, it's just something that I took for granted coming from an area where the norm is a temperate rainforest, and that I know so much about them because I think the average person perhaps in England would not know too much about temperate rainforests, whereas that's something that we did quite a lot in school. Anyways, I think the point I'm trying to make is I'm finding it interesting. If you are into trees and natural history and sort of environmental studies related to conservation and climate change, then you will probably enjoy The Lost Rainforests of Britain by Guy Shrubsole. I'd say some of his chapters are a little bit too long and I've lost interest, but he keeps coming back to interesting points, so that's why I'm persevering with it. And the more and more I get into it, the more I'm impressed that this is indeed a top tier book for Nonfiction November. Yeah, so those are the 5 books. So we've got The Light We Carry by Michelle Obama. We have There's Something in the Water by Ingrid Waldron. We've got Stephen Johnson's The Ghost Map, Trauma Stewardship by Laura van der Lipsky, and The Lost Rainforests of Britain by Guy Shrubsole. I've hopefully have given you a kind of collection, a spectrum of different nonfiction books. I don't think I've talked about any of these books in detail before on my channel, so hopefully they're new and of interest to you. So yes, I'm hoping to get this video up as soon as I can so that we can still enjoy it in the month of November. But in any case, that just leaves me to say that I hope you're doing really well. I hope you are enjoying whatever it is you're reading. If you're reading some nonfiction right now for Nonfiction November, please, I encourage you to put in the comment section what you're reading so that we can all share together. But yeah, I hope you're doing well, and I will see you soon in a new video. Take care. Bye.